This video is brought to you by the 3 Minute Board Game patrons. Keep us independent by supporting us on Patreon. Kia ora koutou, and welcome to our review of The King's Dilemma. The more astute among you will notice that this is a more traditional style review than you're accustomed to on the 3 Minute Board Games channel. And the reason for that is, well, some games just don't fit our format very well. Either due to being too complex, not complex enough, having too much dexterity or real-time elements to them, or in the nature of The King's Dilemma, not really being much of a game and mostly being a storytelling experience. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of the review, let's cover off the basics. It has no solo mode. It's a game for 3 to 5 players. Each individual reign within the game lasts about an hour, and the game can go for 15 odd reigns. And it's a pretty simple game. Now let's blast through the mechanics of the game, because ultimately they're not that important. The core idea is that you are a noble house that advises the king, and you are one of many noble houses within the kingdom. The noble houses of you and the other players are the ones selected to be part of the king's council. And the core gameplay revolves around event cards. So what will happen is one player will draw one of these event cards, and it will have a set of consequences on them. You'll mark those consequences on the board, clearly showing what voting aye will do and what nay will do. And the results of those votes will influence these tracks in the middle of the board. Now, these 5 tracks represent the military might of the kingdom, the wealth of the kingdom, the morale of the people, the health and welfare of the people, and the strength of your scholarship and ingenuity. Various votes will cause these to rise and fall, and along with them, the popularity of the king themselves. So you see, that's tracked using the scales at the side. And if that ever gets to either end, the king will abdicate. Well, how do these votes go down? You have a finite amount of influence tokens, and when it is your turn to vote, you may choose to put that influence on either aye or nay. If you have the most influence on any of those categories, you become the council leader, and that means voting will end with the player to your left. You can also choose to abstain, which allows you to either collect a coin, which can be used for scoring and bribing other players, or you can collect the gavel, which acts as a tiebreaker. The game includes this little cardboard thing as a gavel, but I went out and secured a much more fun one. So you go around and you do a bunch of talking, and then you count up the votes. And that determines which outcome is selected, and therefore what things on the chart move. A huge part of your reasoning behind that is each of you will have a scoring card, and it will show where you want, at the end of that king's reign, these tracks to end up. So for example, in this position, we have the moderate card, and the moderate wants everything to be in the middle of the table. So at the moment, they would score really big because they have 4 things sitting in the middle of the table. And there's only one resource in the extremes. Different results also give you laws that can be passed into effect that end up being placed at the top of the board, and also allow you to open up envelopes. And these envelopes, which are all individually numbered, come with extra cards and extra events. So this is what drives the story. Now, at the end of each reign, based on how many points you scored, you'll get prestige and crave, and you'll also mark off achievements based on your house. The goal of the game is to score the most prestige or crave, depending on, whether you want to undermine the kingdom or whether you want to prop it up. But ultimately, none of that actually matters. The whole scoring system of this game, the whole resolution thing, it's kind of busy work. It's fun busy work, but really all The King's Dilemma is, when you get down to brass tacks, is a pick and path book. And I mean, I love pick and path books. This is the entire Fighting Fantasy collection up here. Fighting Fantasy is kind of what got me into the wider gaming hobby. So when I say something's a pick and path book, that is not a knock on it, but it is just describing it and saying what it actually is. Because what really happens in The King's Dilemma is you kind of get into character about what your house is. So the vote will come up, and you'll come up with blithering reasons and sort of roleplay reasons for why you want a number on this track to move up a certain number of steps. So say the vote is, oh no, someone insulted the king, what should we do? Shall we let it slide because they're a rich person, and that will increase the economy or make us less popular? But if we lock that guy up, it'll ruin the economy. It's those kind of decisions. And ultimately, you're just moving these numbers around on the board in order to get good numbers at the end to mark down better numbers on your chart here. Mechanically, The King's Dilemma it's all about distraction. It's all about busy work to get you to the point where you're reading about the decisions and those decisions are resolved. But it's not much of a game. It's kind of like a DM-less storytelling game, but one that's, heavily on rails. But it is a good story. Well, it's kind of 6 stories. Without getting into too many spoilers, there's 6 main story paths, and each of them goes their own way depending on the decisions you've made. Tied up in an overall story structure, but there's really 6 major subplots. And each of those by itself are quite compelling, and we got quite into them. And as I say, the story was the really good part, what we were really enjoying, the arguing about it and moving the plot along and seeing what happened to this wacky, horrible, terrible kingdom ruled by absolutely terrible people. Like, we were shockers. We did despicable, horrible things during our game. You look at the mechanics again, and you have all these laws that get passed into effect. And ultimately, having these laws in effect didn't really mean jack. It meant that there were opportunities for people to start off with a couple less resources, or they might lose some victory points if, say, you passed into effect 3 negative laws for wealth. Well, you had to try and keep wealth out of the bottom, or else you were going to score even fewer points. But coming last kind of had its own reward anyway, so there's so much mechanical busy work here that I think ultimately takes away from the experience of the storytelling game. And I think I would rather play, again, something a bit simpler, a bit more straightforward, like The Quiet Year. For the Queen. Or this other one that had a Jenga tower in it that I will edit in later once I remember what the hell it is. You see, those games did a similar sort of thing of exploring a kingdom and having a shared role-playing experience. It just didn't have remotely as much busy work down here on this board, and with all these tracking icons and all this other bits and bobs. And that brings me to, I think, the last issue I have with the King's Dilemma, and that is that ultimately it is a giant waste. And the reason for that is ultimately every single thing in this box you throw out, there's nothing worth keeping. Like, there is 0 replayability of this game. All of this crap here. Oh, and the box insert. All of these cards, everything. All of this crap. It just goes in the tip. Like, I really don't know how to feel about that. I mean, it seems excessive. And I kind of knew that going into it, that it was a legacy game and it was disposable. But I don't know. It's one of those things to think that before playing one, and it's actually the case to get to the end of it and realize there's nothing here worth keeping at all. Like, big chunky rulebook, all of these stickers, things you didn't use, all of the envelopes. The tokens aren't even particularly useful for anything. It's just gonna go to the tip. And yeah, I don't think I can do this again. I don't think I can get another legacy game like this that's just this wasteful in the end. Because, Ticket to Ride Legacy, for example, there's still a game there to play at the end. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but there's something. With King's Dilemma, there's nothing. I mean, you could possibly, if you were incredibly fastidious, play it in a way that you could reuse it by, I don't know, putting the stickers down a certain way so that you could unstick them later, or photocopying it. I don't know. But the game is clearly not designed to be in any way, shape, or form salvageable, and I think that's just not for me. I think while I enjoyed the overall story and idea of the King's Dilemma as a concept, I don't think I enjoyed it enough to deal with this, especially not when there are alternatives like, as I say, The Quiet Year, which you can play with just post-it notes. and the deck of cards that comes with it. And if you're done with that, you can just pass it on to someone else. There's another game I've got here as well. The Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective games. They're one and done. They're a big box set game. And there's like 10 or so scenarios in each one, or cases. And once you're done solving them, there's not much point in revisiting them. But you haven't trashed the game. You can sell it on to someone else who can have just as much fun with the cases. And then there's like escape room games. But they're so much smaller. And I'm going to have a look at a couple of those that got sent to me and see just how iffy they are. But yeah, Pandemic Legacy even. There was a pandemic board in that. And you could salvage some of the pieces and do stuff with them. This, like the tokens aren't really useful for anything. The coins, I mean, they're just cardboard coins. It's not like you can't get those in 10,000 other games. The cards really... I mean, they're good card stock, but they're kind of awkward size. So, yeah, that's my final say on the King's Dilemma. It is a kind of neat experience. I think it would be kind of fun to play if it was an app, and I believe they've done one of those, and I think that might be a fun way to do it, where you virtualize everything, you digitize all of this, instead of having it being paper. Because ultimately, this just ain't it. This is not great. And I actually feel kind of shitty having to put all this in the tip after playing that game. So yeah, that's my review of the King's Dilemma. And if you enjoyed this video, hit the notification button, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. The one thing I am going to keep from the King's Dilemma is one of these tokens. And one of his double-sided tokens. And the reason for that is there's a coin toss at some point during the game. And I did the coin toss, and it landed on that top bar up there. And it didn't come back down. It just flicked it up, and it just landed up there. It was like a 1 in a gazillion chance. So I've left the token that I did that up on that bar. That's the one thing I'll keep.